Buddy, hello. It's 3 o'clock or a little bit past 3 o'clock. Today is the last meeting of the year, and we, at least in Amsterdam, have some COVID cases, so it's a little bit less crowded than normal, but still we're excited to host Luca Versteegen, who is a PhD student at the University of Gothenburg. I thought he was Dutch, but that was turned out not to be true. It is so don't judge people by their name, but just ask. That was a good lesson. But Luca has for an early career researcher already done a lot of really interesting work, among others in the Netherlands, in Tilburg, with some political psychologists. And today we'll talk about some of his work on polarization, if I'm not mistaken. And after this meeting, almost immediately, Luca will jump on his bike to cycle to ISPP. So that is at least more active than that I plan to be in the coming days. But for now, Luca, first you still have to do the job of giving us your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barrett, for this kind introduction. I think it's better if you stay at home if you have COVID, so it's actually good, and I'll do the practice work. I hope you can see my slides. Is that okay?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, wait. Not yet.
Yeah, now we see it. Yeah. Oh, now I see it. Yeah. Now, yeah.
Great, that's very good. So I'll just start. Hi, everyone. So I'll just start knowing that everybody's probably quite tired at the end of the semester, and with COVID, your minds may be a bit tired as well. So I'll just start very practically here, showing you 3 pictures that are said to be consequences of affective polarization. Affective polarization, just to remind all of us, is this tendency that you dislike opposing partisans and increasingly like partisans that agree with you. And here it's just to kind of illustrate that a bit. Research has found that as a consequence, if you apply for a new job and you know that your potential new boss votes for a different party than you do, you're less likely to be actually employed, to get the job. Likewise, you're less likely to move to a different place if you know that all the people there vote for a different party than you do. And finally, and probably most importantly, you're less likely to be friends with a person or fall in love with a person if that person votes for a different party. And it's not about this person, but about affective polarization. And in this talk, I won't talk about the consequences of affective polarization so much, but really about what this effect in affective polarization is and what individuals play for a role in affective polarization. But just to give you a little background again, so I just showed you some consequences, and I mean there are like many correlates and probably consequences of affective polarization. It also, at least to some extent, generalizes towards, beyond the US, towards multi-party systems, other Western democracies, and it seems to be more about out-group dislike than in-group liking, but I'll talk about that in more detail in a sec. And some research also shows that it could be reduced to some extent. And just to convince those who aren't persuaded yet that affective polarization is really a thing, this is a very silly illustration to show that interest, at least on Google, for affective polarization has really increased. So it seems to be everywhere in everyone's minds, at least in those who care about politics. But I argue that our attention towards politics, towards affective polarization, is perhaps a bit misplaced, and I'll just explain you why. So affective polarization is something that is kind of like based on research on ideological polarization, where we all know that this is the process of partisans disagreeing increasingly more with each other. And affective polarization, I argue, is actually not as clear as this ideological polarization, because affect, and probably all of you in your lab know that, is quite a broad concept where there are many theories and explanation of what this is about, what and how moods, emotions, and so on can be distinguished from affect, how it is related, and so on. And also, and this is related to how it is measured, I think it's overlooked who is responsible for this affective polarization. Because usually we measure affective polarization in these survey items, the difference between in-group liking, out-group disliking, and then you have this affective polarization. And this is important, obviously, but I guess that this is more the extent to which something is effectively depolarized, right? So this is kind of a state, but it's not what the term polarization suggests, namely a process of something diverging over time. So not a process. And my question then is, who is really actually playing the active part in effective polarization? And I mean, obviously, some research shows that it's the media, social media, the Donald, so political elites in general, who probably kind of fan the flames for effective polarization. But in this paper that I'm presenting today, I want to make the argument that actually individuals are often also responsible for this effective polarization. So it's not something that is just measured as a state on passive voters, but it's actually active partisans who are interested in consolidating effective polarization. And the reason why I'm arguing for that is that I just look on social effective polarization's origin in social identity theory, where they argue that you try to belong to a group, right? And as soon as you belong to the group, you want to make it distinct from other groups, and you want to make your group superior to any outgroup that is relevant. And I mean, people apply all different sorts of biases and kind of misperceptions to keep this image of your group being distinct and being superior to an outgroup. So fine. But I think if that is true, then actually for effective polarization, this would imply that people don't just take effective polarization as something that happens to them, but actually they are motivated to kind of develop this effective polarization further once it is there. They want to make their group even more distinct and more superior to, let's say, the political outgroup. And some ways to do this is obviously to avoid moving to a different town where all people vote Democrats if you are a Republican, for example. But a much less costly way is just to tell stories about the effect, the emotions that you're perceiving that kind of allow to differentiate between us and them. And this is, I mean, a very simple argument that I'm making here. People talk about their emotions that they feel, and they try to create a distance between what we feel and what they feel. And in so doing, they manage to consolidate effective polarization. And for that, I kind of developed 3 different strategies in which people may do that. First, they may talk about their own emotions in a very positive way. So they describe socially and normatively desirable emotions to their in-group. So for example, they may say, well, we care about other people, we love people, we are concerned, we are fearful. So all of these emotions where you think like, I can understand you, I listen to you, and so on. And then simultaneously they talk about the outgroup and they say, well, they are angry, they are disgusted by whatever happens, they don't care, so they're indifferent about, for example, the concerns of women, of children, of whatever. So they really try to devalue the outgroup. And then the third strategy is just a combination of these two, where people say, well, we are loving and caring and so on, they are just hateful and aggressive. And with these 3 strategies, I argue they make this really consolidated effective polarization more dominant in societies. So because individuals are motivated, they actually strengthen effective polarization. And this is the theoretical argument that I'm making in the paper. And my second contribution in that paper then basically is to kind of just illustrate that with qualitative data. And I'll explain why I think qualitative data is actually quite good for that. Obviously, it's not a definite test of the theory. It's just kind of like an illustration. And I hope that future research just hops on that. And then third, I try to kind of contribute towards open science, because this is just my second qualitative paper that I'm ever working on. So I took quite some classes here, and I thought that actually we could do more to kind of improve open science practices here. So in terms of pre-registration, that is actually sometimes useful for qualitative research, but also kind of like more documentation, supplements, and so on. And I'm trying to contribute with that, and hope to push this a bit more. So just for the empirics here, I studied radical right voters together with a colleague right before the election in Germany last year. And I'm not necessarily interested in radical right voters in this paper, but I think that they make a very good case for studying my argument, because effective polarization is particularly strong around radical right voters. So they are actually particularly inclined to use these emotion narratives. And also right before the election, obviously, the polarization is particularly strong again. So I hope that I can really kind of exploit all the different emotions at hand. Yeah, we recruited all these radical right voters through local politicians and social media, and then use snowball sampling basically to get our sample. And I'm happy to talk about more details here if you're interested in that. When it comes to the analysis, I conducted a thematic analysis where you transcribe all these lengthy interviews and familiarize yourself with them, and then you just start identifying the themes. And themes here are patterns, in my case, in which individuals talk about emotions and use them in a particular way to reach these identity goals, or perhaps even others that I didn't predict in my theory. And once you have that, you develop a meta memo where you try to see if this is actually something that is consistent across cases. And based on that, then you develop a codebook. And you then try to validate that on all your data and take a month break, and then you test intra-rater reliability. And as soon as that is satisfying, you can actually do the whole coding of the data. We had 30 interviewees, which with interview lengths of 45 minutes to 3 hours actually. And that is basically what you do to all the interviews. I should really say that these codes, right, are just what a calculator basically is in quantitative research. So it's not the result, but it's really the tool to kind of get to your interpretive work in a more consistent manner. I'll just give you an example of how this code actually looks like. This is for sadness, and you basically have 5 quality criteria for each code. You have a label and then define what this code is. So this is not a definition of the emotion. Obviously, it's really just a very shallow definition of the code. You describe where you find it, define inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then have an example. And this is a descriptive finding. So these are all the emotion expressions that I identified in the interviews. And I should really say this is not what people felt, right? And I mean, we know, or you actually know quite well, that it's hard to measure emotions, and you kind of try to use implicit measures, physiological measures, and so on, because people may actually not really talk about what they're feeling, or they may exaggerate that, phrase it in a different way, and so on. So this is just what they're talking about, and not necessarily what they're feeling about. And also there's a note of caution, given that some emotions are just easier to express verbally in interviews. So for example, it's quite easy to identify anger, for example, but like more complex emotions like loneliness or so are probably much harder to identify. And then thirdly, it's also clear that this doesn't really tell us anything about how they are used, right? And therefore I try to identify the basis in which emotions were used, so kind of like the context in which they phrased their emotions. So these are all the emotions, and this is again just an illustration just to kind of explain what I'm talking about here. So I tried to identify the way in which people talked about emotions. So for example, they said personal emotions, I'm fearful because I am afraid of going out in the dark. And then society was really when they talked about society in general without referring to any particular group. So for example, I'm really concerned when I think about climate change or how technology develops. And then people used more kind of elaborate emotions to make a case for any political group. So for example, they said, well, I fear that we'll have a green left autocracy soon. Or I'm afraid, I'm very concerned regarding migrants flooding the country, and so on. So they tried to use this fear to make a political case. And then conversation emotion, for example, was just, I fear I can't answer your question. So this was basically the noise category that you had in the data, and I tried to kind of exclude that. And I then developed this widget here that is online available, where I just, for the 27 emotions, basically try to find more examples for all of them. So you can click on them, and then you have these 12 bases here, and then you find examples of what I meant, for example, by pride that was ascribed to others. Okay, so that's basically everything that you should need before. And now, given that I know that people are often disappointed if you don't get lengthy quotes from qualitative work, these are just 3 illustrations of what I actually found. The first one, and these are all pseudonymized, is Tobias trying to elevate the in-group. So the first strategy, by talking about the pride that he felt when he took to the streets with his political colleagues. So basically how the group got strength just from practicing politics, so to say. The second then is Peter, who said, well, everyone who can't feel that girls are scared of migrants just don't have empathy, right? So he kind of dehumanized the other by saying, well, if you don't understand that, you don't experience empathy, so you don't have this emotion. He denied that to them. And then the third one, this is the third strategy. Here, this guy tried to create in-group, out-group distancing by just talking about his negative experiences of the Greens, which are the political outgroup here, as a radical right AfD voter. So he, just before that, talked about the positive emotions that he experiences in his in-group, and then talks, yeah, but let's talk about the Greens, actually. They have these unpleasant and immature modes of action. And just to summarize how this looks like, actually, these are the three strategies and the narratives in which people kind of consolidated effective polarization. So here on the upper left, people really tried to display their own group as innocent and caring. They said, like, yeah, I'm sad when I think about the developments that are currently happening. I'm really regretting what is happening, what the left Green does to, I don't know, the gender values and so on. So they were like using these normatively desirable emotions to make their argument about why this is going in the wrong direction. Likewise, they considered themselves disappointed, surprised. They were like suggesting that they were really trying to understand developments, and I can't make sense of it. I'm really surprised, and I'm doing my best to understand this. And then in the second one, they really made this in-group strong by talking about particular events that made them proud as Germans, for example, but also as AfD voters. So they really tried to define and strengthen this in-group by associating socially positive emotions with that. Likewise, nostalgia, and there is cool research by Anouk Smekes who actually shows how nostalgia is related to radical right support. They often talked about this nostalgia here to make a case that their political in-group is actually trying to express the heritage of a strong, cool culture. And obviously, at the end, they were also talking about many events where they experienced happiness or even enthusiasm in any political group-based events. And then finally, they tried to display themselves as tolerant, as very liberal, saying, well, I don't care about these developments, I'm completely fine with all of that. So they really tried to put themselves in a socially desirable light. Regarding the second strategy then, they ascribe quite some fear to the outgroup, saying, well, the green lefts, they're just acting from a position of fear. They just don't dare doing anything. They're in a fear bubble and so on. And consequently, they ridiculed them, were sarcastic about this group, and had quite some examples of how this group would actually be completely stupid. The green left, but also all the groups that are related to the green left, like sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, and so on. And then interestingly, while they had used indifference to kind of display themselves as tolerant in the first strategy, they now used it in a very different way to just say, well, they don't care about anything, right? The green left, they're just apathetic. They are not caring about the concerns of girls, of the hardworking class, and so on. And then finally, they had this way of dehumanizing the other, denying them any emotions at all, saying, well, in good cases, they're just angry, but sometimes they're evil. They have just like this complete hatred that I can see in their eyes. And they kind of talked about them in a very disgusted way, kind of like almost degrading them to animals. And then finally, for the third strategy, they contrasted these emotional experiences in the way they described emotions, saying, well, we are proud, we are actually happy, we're the people who still know how to live, but when we think about these other groups, we are getting quite ashamed, and actually they are an embarrassment for Germany and so on. And likewise, this we are loving, concerned, and so on, and they're just hateful and evil. And interestingly, then, two emotions that I didn't really expect in isolation would actually also contribute to this strategy was envy and stubbornness. And here, envy you can only experience if there's another, right? You can't be envy if there's nobody you can compare yourself to. So this was also important for creating this in-group, out-group distancing narrative. Yeah, just to wrap up, I think this kind of paper shows that there's quite some merit in using explicit measures. So if we really assume that this is not what they really feel, you can't measure that with qualitative interviews at all. But you can just examine how people want to be portrayed, how they portray themselves. And I think this is actually something that is really interesting because it emphasizes this idea of identity goals that people have in effective polarization. But then what do they actually feel? And I'd ideally love to kind of get more into this, how there's divergence between true experiences and what people tell, like these emotion narratives, what they tell us to feel. And then relatedly, if you can tell emotion narratives to increase effective polarization, can you actually also tell narratives that would actually bring people back together? And then finally, this was just about one pole, right? This was about the radical right. And again, I don't necessarily think that this is just unique to the radical right. Certainly there will be like some variety. People will use different emotion narratives, a different intensity and so on. But I think this is generally something, if the social identity origin of effective polarization is true, that all partisans should be motivated in. And I think, again, and this is really my summary, acknowledging the individual's role in effective polarization is important because it also tells us why effective polarization really increases once it is there, because individuals are motivated to consolidate it. And if we acknowledge that, we can actually also understand that individuals have quite some responsibility towards mitigating it. Of course, there's the media, Twitter, and so on, and this needs to be handled, but then individuals may also have quite some role in that. Yeah, I thank you for listening. I thank our interviewees, and just as Bert mentioned in the beginning, I'll be cycling to ISPP from tomorrow on, and if you know anybody on Twitter or so that you think might be willing to donate, I'm obviously very happy if you could share this, supporting Ukrainians who can't work anymore, Ukrainian scholars at risk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Luca, for this fascinating presentation, and what a nice and lofty goal at the end. Will you do some interviewing while you cycle as well, or you have to concentrate on the road?
I mean, if I still have energy and so on. Yeah.
I mean, you're starting Hungary, so I guess there's
That's a good start. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me take the opportunity to ask the first question. Well, let me I'll start with a little warning and then go to my question. I think especially at the end you were using the word true feelings a lot, and I mean we never really know what the true feelings are. Nevertheless, I do think that what they tell us are, I mean, those are their feelings. Like that's what they want to express to us. Whether they have any other thoughts or whether there are sort of biological processes, or whether these are because they're describing situations in which they encounter group, whether the whole process that they describe is similar for them in the words that they use. Of course, we don't know that. That's I think why you're using this language of true feelings. But I think we should be careful labeling anything to be true or not true. I think they're all equally true and equally interesting to collect. They're just different aspects of the container concept of emotion. Okay, but my question is, I think it's a really interesting coding scheme that you've used, but can you say a bit more about where it comes from and what the reliability of this scheme is?
Yeah, thanks for the warning. I think that's a very important argument. I always feel that I kind of need to emphasize that these emotions, and I'll use this term again, don't show true emotions because it's just what people are talking about, and then it's what I am interpreting, right? So I try to kind of like probably prevent some quantitative researchers who would be right, I guess, arguing, is that actually really what you can say about that? But I absolutely agree that this is not actually what you can say, because there is no true and false. Regarding the coding scheme, so I'm following this theory here, this method by Boyatzis, who developed thematic analysis and this coding scheme then, and other people basically hopped on this and developed this and so on. But I then also would say, well, there are still some issues that I don't feel comfy with when it comes to this analysis. So, for example, actually, when would you say that a theme is sufficiently relevant? And therefore, I'd kind of like try to give as much context around my results in terms of additional examples to kind of illustrate what I get here. So regarding reliability, I mean, I have this intra-rate reliability after a month to really make sure that I get what I measure what I meant with my initial coding scheme. And like, you always have this repetitive process of just clarifying your coding scheme and so on, and then my colleague look at it. So I think I would say, for what we can get from such qualitative interviews, I would say it's fairly accurate.
Thanks. Sanne here has a question.
Hey, hi, nice to see you. Thanks for the presentation. I was really interested in your experiences with open science in qualitative research. Would you say it was more or less challenging than with quantitative research, as you have experience with both? What are any additional challenges in practicing open science with qualitative research that you experienced?
Yeah, maybe in addition to that, maybe you can tell us what you pre-registered.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question, and I think I can't really say what the challenges are until I've published this, because I assume that quite some people who are very much into qualitative research will criticize this, that I'm taking a too quantitative approach here. So, for example, with my illustrations, because it almost gets to something that is what they would consider counting, and it's like getting less interpretative, but more like this positivist stance. So I think this is something that I would be criticized in. And obviously, then there are questions like, what can you actually pre-register? And here we pre-registered our question guide, the full project, the main theories, although I should say that actually what this paper is about hasn't even been in the pre-registration. However, I think that it is good because there's this publication bias, right? And I mean, in qualitative research, it's quite a thing because, and I talk to some people who are just like disappear in the field for quite some time, and then they publish something about something that they think is relevant. And here, my idea is to kind of like just tell people, well, this is what we were actually interested in the beginning, and this is what we found now. And probably this would also deserve a paper to like show how what we thought would be interesting in the beginning is actually completely different from what we found is interesting. So for example, in Germany, like this East-West divide and so on is something that we didn't anticipate at all, weren't really interested in the beginning, but that was such a reoccurring topic that it's probably a problem if you don't talk about that, if you talk about this project. Other challenges, I think one thing that I would actually like to do is publish all the transcripts, because I mean there are some people who can like do really cool stuff with it as well. I think these are actually quite extensive interviews that could be interesting, but this is something that I just can't do for ethical reasons, so I don't have approval for that. But I think these are the major challenges. So something that I'm trying is just to give as much documentation about the process and why I decided to do things in a particular way. So for example, also to say, well, this is how I define emotions, and then I have a supplement text on like reviewing the most important emotions theories, just to explain why I coded a particular emotion in that way. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Luca. There's a question from Tobias. That's not one of your respondents, but yeah.
Hopefully not.
I think not, because he's from Switzerland. Tobias Rohrbach asks, I appreciate the qualitative approach. It seems like your findings align well with your expectations. Were there any surprises or accidental discoveries?
Yeah, I mean, that I would say is another problem with this qualitative research, right? It always kind of aligns with your expectations to some extent. I think I would have expected this contrasting to be much more relevant, because people always compare themselves. I mean, this whole relative deprivation literature and so on, and especially social identity based literature suggests that you always compare yourself to each other, but here actually people really, I felt at least, talk about this in isolation. So this is something that I was surprised by. And then obviously this envy and stubbornness was not something that I would have ever anticipated that would be used in isolation for this third narrative. And then something that I was also just, I first thought that it was a limitation of my approach, but I think it's actually something that's just happening, is that people use the same emotions for different narratives, right? So this is not something that, like, one emotion is just about one narrative and it can just be used to elevate your in-group, for example, but people used fear to kind of like appear normatively socially desirable, but used fear also to really devalue the outgroup. And this is something that first I was like, yeah, okay, but each emotion for one strategy, but this is obviously not how it works. And I mean, there are also gender differences, age differences in how people use these emotions. So this is something that, was surprising to me.
Okay, thanks. Going back to the scheme that you've showed, I'm surprised to see there are a whole bunch of terms such as uncertainty, which is more an appraisal, I'd say. Sarcasm, which is more a specific linguistic form. Why are these all clustered as emotions?
Yeah, I thought about that for quite a while, because initially I was thinking about just using the basic emotions, 6 of them, or like extend that by a bit. And then I was thinking, okay, sarcasm, for example, is something that is actually something that you do as a rhetorical form. It's like a behavior, a rhetorical behavior, but it's so close to emotions like anger and bitterness that it's actually reflecting some feeling. And some literature in the sociology of emotions really talks about how people, the experience they have when feeling devalued by the outgroup, trying to elevate themselves above the other group, and therefore are sarcastic. So this is nothing that psychological research would probably consider an emotion, but the sociology of emotion would do. So this is something where I would say, and I again clarify that in the supplements, it's very at the edge, and I very well understand that some people would not consider this an emotion, stubbornness likewise, and so on. But again, others actually would say, well, this is either an emotion or it's so close to an emotion that is different than just anger, for example, that it deserves to be coded as an emotion here.
Yeah, so I think you either call this something more like a narrative representation of feelings, instead of an emotion. That there could be one way out. The other thing, literature suggestion I would have for you is to look at this work by Alan Cohen, and Disa Sauter, Jessica Tracy, Dagger Keltner. It's called Mapping the Passions. And so it's, at first I thought you were using that work because they also identified 27 emotions. But there are two things. So they developed this also from the bottom up. What I think is particularly interesting there is that they step away from this idea of discrete emotions, but rather representation of emotions in a multidimensional space, so that there are also emotions that you can talk about emotions in terms of how close or how distant they are from each other. And that allows also for different sorts of more detailed or less detailed mappings. And I think there's a lot of overlap between the scheme you have, with the exception of those things that I just mentioned, like sarcasm and uncertainty.
Yeah. No, yeah, I'm aware of that paper, and I mean, like the reason why I have 27 emotions is actually that this is what I found at the end. That makes most sense. So, for example, I mean, fear and anxiety, for example, are theoretically different, but it's very hard, and it becomes quite quickly, it becomes unreliable if you make coding decisions here. So this is the reason why I stick to that. So I am aware that this is actually not in line, for example, with the Cohen and Kellner paper. And then again, it's easier to categorize these emotions than using dimensions, although I understand that this is also a problem. If you just say, well, this is one category and not the other, and that a dimensional approach could actually theoretically even fit better to my theoretical argument. So I think that's a fair point, yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Bert has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks, Luca. I think this qualitative approach to this particular question is really interesting and important to do, because I think feeling thermometer differences have been correlated enough with different outcomes, and I think you're doing something that we could really learn something from, that we don't get from the surveys. On the one hand, what I'm going to ask you might sound like an easy question, but it might. In your presentation, you in the method section are very cautious about the sampling and the snowballing, but then the conclusions are rather generic. And there, I do think, for me, I'd say I'd be a little bit more cautious, because in this non-random sample of one relatively extreme and polarized party, and also a particular region, right? I noticed it mostly was Eastern Germany. You might get patterns of results that are not generalizable to the particular broader population of anything, right? And I don't think that's the goal of the study. So my question is, how far can we generalize this? And that is not to make it smaller, because I'd say it's interesting, but there are limits to what we can say with this. So where do you think, how generalizable is this representative of all far right voters or all German citizens, or so what are the implications of this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I consider this, and this is quantitative language, a likely case to just find these emotion or feeling narratives, as Gijs has just said. And I think it would generalize to some extent to other radical right voters, but also to left green voters. And I just have this anecdotal evidence that green left voters also talk about radical right voters just being aggressive, angry, without any empathy, and so on. So I think this is like this devaluing narrative again. So I would assume that I would find that in not necessarily only radical right electorates, but also in other ones. But obviously this is just like to kind of show how the idea works, the theory works, show what I mean by illustrating it. But now, like, my next step would actually be to, and I'm not sure if this would work with surveys, but perhaps just use experimental approaches to like see if this radical right electorate really uses these narratives if they have the choice, and then also see if this generalizes across other radical right groups, and perhaps also to the other side, and if this generalizes first of all, and how actually also they are using just different narratives or none at all.
But there I would make one point of caution, that how I understand social identity theory and polarization, this is only among the very engaged and the people who are strongly identifiers. And that is all still interesting, but we should be careful to argue that everybody who is of a party will talk badly about the other side, because I think their academics, and I might even myself been a little bit guilty of this, maybe we're pushing a narrative that is not what most voters do, right? Jana Krupnikov and John Ryan have a book that says, well, the big divide is not polarization, it's engagement. Most people just don't care too much about politics. And that, for me, resonates very much with how I see the world in the Netherlands. So I'd say, well, yes, this is true among the strong far-right voters, and maybe also the strong Social Democrats and the strong Greens, etc. But I doubt this is true among the people who are just leaners.
Yep.
For whom their identity is not so strong, right? The work I've done on identity, it's the distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle. I even doubt that people in the middle do this stuff. I actually doubt it.
Yeah, thank you. That point is very well taken. I think you're absolutely right. And probably I made this argument too quickly. You're right. I think the end, it's the ones who are motivated are only those who are actually engaged in politics. Yeah.
But, we've seen in various events what that small group can do, so it's not irrelevant to study it. But I do think to make a little bit of a caution on the that it's just voters that do this. No, it's the strong identifiers.
Absolutely, I get that. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Patrick Stewart. He writes, interesting research. I appreciate the open science approach. The question I would have builds off of your finding of emotion term use and misuse. Were there individual differences in the extensiveness of their introspection and interoception and the likelihood of polarizing? For example, seeing the world simplistically in emotion terms, which may lead to simplifying through polarization.
Yeah, I think, again, a good question. I probably need to think about that a bit longer. So there were individual differences, and I was actually surprised and quite happy how diverse our sample was for qualitative. I mean, we only have 30 people, right? Sample in terms of social background, age, gender, but also education. And absolutely, people phrased this very, very differently, right? So there were some people who've kind of intellectualized this, how they talked about the other group and their motivations, but I couldn't say for now that they are really. Yeah, I guess I got to think about that. So they phrased it differently. Some also they used different emotions. So for example, there was one worker who was he was constantly devaluing the outgroup. He was an early retired worker. He was constantly devaluing the outgroup, but he wasn't really elevating the in-group because I guess he actually didn't have such a strong in-group besides being a radical right voter. And then there were others who were just talking about how great their in-group and their motivations are. But regarding interoception, yeah, I would need to think about that. I think that's a good point.
Can you say a bit more how you prompted people to talk about their in-group and their out-group?
Yeah. So as this was a general project where we tried to understand AFD voters' intentions for supporting the AFD, but also how they experience current societal political developments and so on. And we talked about some social subgroups like gender and so on, but also ethnicity and race and what that would play for a role in Germany and in the elections. But we didn't necessarily talk about the political outgroup. So this was something that people kind of started talking about when they, for example, would talk about their gender values. They started talking about first how they felt about these gender values, and then they started talking about how the left-green would actually completely misinterpret what gender is about and what women, for example, should actually do. So we didn't prompt them directly to talk about the other group, which could be a strength, but also has some problems, perhaps.
Yeah, because I mean, are there then also individuals who don't talk about the in-group, out-group at all?
Again, they're doing that in very different ways, but all of our 27 participants that I analyzed at the end were using in-group and out-group narratives to some extent, which I guess is like very natural if you assume that everybody is kind of like engaged in some groups as a human being. Yeah.
Bert, do you have another question or?
Yeah, I for sure had a thought. The one thought but this relates to the prompts. So one thing that Gijs and I have been talking about for years, but probably will never do, is to put up a sort of a voting booth and let people send messages to politicians, like sort of record it. And I was wondering if you want to scale some of this by allowing open-ended responses, if you could think about if you want to diversify the sample, more far-right voters or other groups, then sort of trying to get ways to send people maybe messages to in-group or out-group members, or to record some of that might be a way to do this in a manner that is a bit more scalable than 3 hours with person one at the same time.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm like intending to take up after summer. So first kind of run experiments and see how people use different narratives if they have the choice. Do they try to kind of increase polarization, as I would argue, or do they actually try to decrease, or what are they doing? And then the second thing is, if you just allow them to talk about whatever in these open-ended questions, can you actually find these narratives as well?
Yeah.
I'm not sure yet about how I would code this. If I can find like a mix of qualitative and quantitative measures. If you have suggestions, that would be cool. Yeah, to be honest, I didn't really thought about analysis here. This is something that I need to take time on.
Yeah.
So I'm all ears if you have.
So one thing I would think of relating to my previous question is to think about, to maybe see if you can get some variation in the degree of identity with these parties.
Mm-hmm.
If the rhetoric starts to change.
And even some variation probably in how you recruit people.
Yeah.
I mean, the very minor priming that Bert did with Yves, because we're telling people what the survey will be about.
Yeah.
And it already gives people some leads people to at least report differently on some questions.
Yeah.
I don't know, what was the current
I think that, yeah, that's a good point, guys. Yeah.
But I mean that would, for now, that would show
probably a bit of an underappreciated.
Yeah, go ahead, Luca.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that would show. I mean, what Bert just said regarding that only the polls would actually be motivated to do that, right? It wouldn't talk about like the people in the middle. But I think that makes sense. But then I would actually also be interested in these open questions, I don't know, on MTurk or so, see if people use these narratives more broadly on the left, on the right, if they just write about something. But here, like what I would kind of prompt people to talk about, I don't know yet. Yeah.
Have you thought about looking at sort of more naturalistic stuff like opinion blogs? I mean, in the US context, people have used Reddit for such things. that could at least be an easy way to scale up.
Yeah. What would you analyze there, just to see if people use these strategies in their blogs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could subset on political blogs, maybe even more specifically than that. And then you would have to sort of at least give your analysis some sort of automated aspect, because it's too much material otherwise. But
Yeah.
and you need to have some sort of selection, because there will also be a lot of stuff that is probably not relevant for your question.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
All right. Any more questions? Nice one. Yeah. All right. Shall we round it up then, Bert?
Yep. Okay. I want to thank you, Luca, for it's really a cool study. I think it's really stimulating to think a bit more about this qualitative approach to understanding these phenomena. This also wraps up the academic year, at least for the Hot Politics Lab series. That means that from this week onwards, there will be no Friday sessions. Still means you can obviously look back in our archive. I also want to thank our sponsors. This time I won't forget automatically. Among others, the European Research Council, the Society for Politics and the Life Sciences, the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, the Amsterdam School of Communication Research, and probably some people who feel left out. We will be back in early September with a couple of talks that due to COVID were cancelled. So early September, probably have Hans van der Maas, Professor of Psychological Methods, and Flavio Azevedo on measurement of ideology. And Han will talk about his ideas of how opinions change or beliefs change over time. And we will be putting together an exciting set of talks. So same time, same place, 3 to 4 Fridays in Amsterdam or on the Zoom. So have a good summer. Don't catch COVID, or if you do, make sure it's mild. And we'll all see you hopefully again after the summer.
Or
Thank you so much for having me, right?
We're actually
you could.
If you're going to ISPP, so I know that Lucas is coming, but we're also going with most of the people from the lab, and there will be a politics lab and Center for the Politics of Feelings joint reception in a place and time to be determined. But it will be in Athens. That's for sure. And you're all welcome to join us.
If I knew that, I would have come.
Yeah, sure. Skip your son's birthday.
But this time it's not my son's birthday. It's the only conference that it's just a lack of credits at home anymore. So it's just but that's what it is.
You shouldn't catch Corona so often.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's advantages of not getting it too often.
We've had all the sub-varines now, so
yeah, it's just annoying. And it's literally like April 10th was the last time. 9th.
Well, all right.
But anyways,
all right.
Thank you, Luca.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ja.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have een goed weekend, jongens.